We are live. This is A Goy for Jesus. I'm here with my partner in crime, the other Paul. Maybe crime
G'day.
literally at some point in Australia.
Yeah, likely.
uh, Please, I'll have a a link to his channel, or you can put a link in the live stream too if you want, Paul, to your channel.
All good. I'll do that.
Well, so we've done I don't know how many videos in the past, like 3 or 4 or something. Usually
Yeah, I
about
think that's around right. Yeah.
usually around your expertise of Greek and my expertise of scare quotes expertise of Catholicism. And or at least my wheelhouse of Catholicism might be better to say. But
Yeah, that's right.
we're not really talking about Catholicism today, or we wanted to get a lowdown on. There's so much stuff in the media and the internet and the social Twitter and stuff like that about Australia, and I figure who
That's
better
right.
to help us figure out what's actually going on in Australia than an Australian Christian. And we're going to focus on the Australian church. Paul, I first want you to kind of give us the lowdown before we get into church issues in Australia. What is going on in Australia in terms of I don't want to muck up the algorithms, but the COOF or whatever code word we want to give it. Uh, um, Not that I care too much if they throttle us or whatever, but I do want to get the word out, so that's why
Yeah, 100%.
that's why I want to kind of get the get that. So for lack of the better term, the COOF. So what's going on? Just give us the lowdown, and then we'll go from there.
Yep, 100%. Thanks again for having me, Jeff. I always love our streams. To put it simply, well, with respect to the state of the virus, it's the virus, or the Wu flu, whatever we want to call it. I'll say the virus. With the state of that, it's compared to most other nations, just on a regardless of whatever we think of how bad it is or not, how deadly, how not deadly. It's just nothing compared to absolutely nothing compared to most nations. Not that bad compared to, say, certain states in the United States, many third world areas. That's not really the main area of concern, though. The main problem, big takeaway, is that Australia is simply a tyranny. It's not a hypothetical anymore. It's not an exaggeration, as many people would say, or just the thing where it's like, oh, if we keep going down this path, we're going to be going down to tyranny. It's tyranny now. The tyranny is here. It's established. This has technically always been the case with respect to our law, but the Australian government and governments on the state level have made it clear and explicit that there is no such thing as rights. And I don't like to use post-Enlightenment language like rights and all that stuff, but basic
limits to
human
government.
That's right. Yeah, there is no such thing as limits to government. There's no such thing as jurisdictional boundaries between the state and one's personal life. And particularly, as we'll discuss later, the jurisdiction between the state and the church. What belongs to Caesar? What belongs to God? That doesn't exist. Despite funnily enough, sadly enough, many people who call themselves Christians, which I like to distinguish from actual Christians for obvious reasons, they like to celebrate that, as we'll be discussing later. So the area I'm best known with is, of course, my own local area. So this would be Sydney in the state of New South Wales. And
South Wales. Okay, so New South Wales is your is it a province? Is that how
it's a state? It's a state, like a state in America. And okay. My area, Sydney, is, well, the city of Sydney.
Now, and, for I guess mainly my American audience. So I'm not sure how much you know about American governmental structures, but at least, especially pre-Civil War. Okay, so pre-Civil War, the states have lost more and more sovereignty over time, where the distinction between the federal and the state has lessened over time. But the state, and essentially what was supposed to be in the original founding of the United States, was that anything not mentioned in the Constitution, the states did, and
Hmm.
that's kind of been blurred over time.
Yeah.
In the last 100 years or so. So I was wondering, what's the distinction between what the federal governments do in Australia versus the states relative.
Yeah.
Because I hear there's differences between the states, but I'm not sure. Like, can the federal government impose stuff, or is it all like the local state governments or something like that?
Yeah. So a few of my friends would obviously. I'm not like an expert in the minutiae of the law, but I do know general stuff that I have read. Although maybe and I don't know if any one of my law friends are watching, but if you'd like to give some extra details in the comments, that would be really well appreciated. But either way, what I do know now is that we don't have. It's not a matter of degree of difference of how much we value state sovereignty. It just doesn't exist at all. So the overarching area of authority, since it's an issue like with Australia, right, being a commonwealth, there's idea of sovereignty ultimately coming from the crown and then trickling downwards. Whereas with the United States, you have your state sovereignty, and that's innate. The Fed can't override that, except obviously on constitutional issues. At least that's how it was originally, as you mentioned. With Australia, though, the basic legal thing is that if a state has a law that contradicts the law of the Commonwealth, so the federal government in our case, then it's null and void. So whatever the federal government has a law on a certain issue, the states have to comply. The states have semi-autonomy insofar as they can make individual laws, individual policies, and so on and so forth. And that's been extremely apparent with this case, where different states have done wildly different things on the whole COVID policy here in Australia. But regardless of that, if the federal government legislates on a certain area, then the states follow suit. There may be exceptional areas, and I suspect there may be. I'm just not personally aware of them. They probably would be, but by and large, it's an established fact that the federal government here in Australia, the Commonwealth, whatever they make law, the states simply can't contradict it. There really is no concept of state sovereignty like there is, or perhaps used to be, in the United States, and perhaps it still is to an extent, depending on your state, especially.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So on areas of law, it's very centralized, very, very centralized. If you're talking about the spectrum of the states' rights versus the Federalists back in the early United States, Australia is all the way in the Federalists and then some. Probably some of the Federalists in the early United States would have looked at Australia today and be like, far out, even we don't want that. So yeah, it's heavily, heavily centralized. Mummy state, nanny state, all that.
All right. So I guess maybe if you could go over what you're allowed to do, maybe that'd be easier than what you're not allowed to do. And then maybe delve into the psychology of, maybe once we're done that, maybe we go into the psychology of the population in general. Like, I know it's not going to be uniform, but
yeah, that's right.
Then if you could go into, okay, what are you allowed or not allowed to do during the COOF?
Yeah, so we are allowed to go out for exercise. A few days ago, that was limited to only 1 hour a day outside for exercise.
They do know
yeah, go on.
I'm sorry for having to interrupt here, but I have to make this point before I forget. They do know, like, obesity is, like, after age, the number one contributing to bad outcomes for the COOF, right? So they only let you exercise 1 hour a day. And
I'm sorry, Jeff. Are you a fringe conspiracy theorist now? Are you saying you're a medical expert? Can I see your degree? Can I see your degree, mate?
Well, I'm sorry, but it's just like, if you're not allowing exercise, that sounds like outside.
Yeah. They
have infinite ventilation.
Well, they do. They would obviously give the excuse you can exercise inside and in your backyard and all that stuff. Like, when they say outside, they more or less mean outside the front door of your house. Like, they can't police backyards. So that's, although then again, many people don't have backyards. So people in apartments, yeah, you're kind of screwed. But until very recently, so the gracious overlords in the New South Wales Parliament recently removed that 1 hour restriction on the front yard. So I have to say thank you to our gracious overlords, Gladys Berejiklian, our Premier, and our Health Minister, Bradley Hazard, and our Chief Medical Officer, Dr. Kerry Chan. I thank you, our tri-unity of overlords, for your absolute grace in allowing us to exercise for more than 1 hour at a time outside. Thank you.
Triumvirate.
The triumvirate. That's it. Yes, the triumvirate. That's the much better way to put it. But other than that, we are allowed to go. We are allowed to go out for very few specific reasons. So if we are an authorized worker, so that's a thing right now. Most places of business, that is businesses that have like a physical presence outside the home, most places more or less are shut. They've been forced to shut. Like, so this is especially the case with hospitality. So if you're a hospitality business and like you have like a restaurant, for example, you can't open, except you're allowed, well, at least you're not allowed to have people inside. You're not allowed to have people sit inside, sit outside, anything like that. You can for the most part, like obviously do your business, but it has to be either people just picking up and immediately leaving, or through delivery services. So delivery services like Uber Eats, Menulog, they've shot through the roof right now with use. So other than that, places like cafes, so those places that don't do deliveries, like cafes, for example, they're just shut. They're just straight up shut. And there is actually a list on the New South Wales government website of authorized workers, so places that are allowed to still have work with a physical presence. Otherwise, every single other business, every other occupation must be done at the home. And if they can't do that, well, your stuff, you have to shut down, at least for the time being. So
just a quick question: do the businesses get paid, or the workers get paid, or?
Yes, good. It's good you brought that up. There is a greatly expanded. This has already existed, but they've greatly expanded government welfare services. So, welfare issues you have in the United States, times that by 10, the welfare state is huge here. So, in particular, there's a service called JobSeeker we have here in New South Wales. I'm not sure if that's a federal or a state one. I do believe it's actually no, I believe it's federal, but don't quote me on that. But JobSeeker is basically if you're out of work, then you can apply to them and you can get money. And in many cases, you can get upwards of $750 a week for not working. So that, as I've even heard personal accounts from people I know, it's more of an incentive just to lose your job and to go on JobSeeker and get money for doing nothing. So that's a real phenomenon happening right now. It's very generous in many parts. Although on the converse side, many people have very expensive rent, because if there's one thing you know, especially here in Sydney, Australia, property and rent is extremely expensive. So for many people, and they've been very loud and vocal about this, even the job seeker thing is not enough. So that's a big case right now. There's a big welfare net. But other than that,
are the businesses themselves ruined, or do they give money to the businesses?
I believe there is something for that. I'm not sure, but for the most part, and I've personally even spoken with people and businesses around here. For the most part, it is the government just leaves them to die, lose their revenue, all that stuff. They're hanging on. The places that are hanging on that do have a physical presence are like takeaway places, for example. They're still hanging on because in the end there is still a great demand for takeaway, and arguably more so now, given that we're forced in our homes for most of the day.
So if you're like a used coin dealer or something, you know, stamp and coin place for antiques or something, you're basically done. You're wiped out.
Yeah, unless you have like a properly working delivery apparatus, you're stuffed.
And then or businesses that usually rely on foot traffic or something like that.
That's right. Yeah, they're totally screwed.
Is this basically benefiting? I guess Amazon's in your country too.
Oh yeah, 100%.
It's almost like the COOF was designed by Amazon and whatever other big box.
Whoa, man, that's just a fringe theory now, bro.
No, I'm not saying it was, but like,
our official benevolent government and fact checker sources say that's not true.
I'm not saying it's true, but I'm saying, what is it? There, somebody has the three laws, three conservative laws of something. I forget what it's called, but One of them is that any institution that's not explicitly conservative will drift to be liberal over time. The other one is if you want to understand how a bureaucracy works, you should just assume it's been taken over by its enemies. An organization has been taken over by its enemies.
More or less. I see that out working everywhere around me.
Some people have speculated, at least in this country, and again, I don't know if it's intentional or not, but that small businesses, at least in our country, tend to be more. It allows people to be more independent, have a source of wealth. It's easier to control if you're in a fascist, and I mean that in the technical definition of fascism, not the everybody I hate is bad fascism. Like, so Tito and Mussolini would fall under this, not every genocidal maniac, it's easier to control big companies to the will of the state, if that makes sense. So anyway, you can continue. So no exercise except
well,
a little bit of exercise.
So we can exercise now. They just, like a few days ago, released removes the 1 hour restriction on outdoor exercise. You are allowed to exercise. I believe now they also lift the limit on 2 people. So just not only until very recently, there was a limit on exercise for 2 people. I'm kind of slightly iffy on that, so I've got to get back to the government sources on that with New South Wales. So yeah, either way, there's a very, very big restriction on everything else. Otherwise, the most you can do outside is exercise, or you can go to the shops to do essential services. So this would be like groceries or the health clinics, things that are for your very basic needs. But with respect to essential services, and we'll obviously get on this a little bit later, they obviously don't consider spiritual needs essential. So which we'll get onto with respect to the church. They don't consider that essential services. So other than that, you got to be exercising. You got to be going to the shops. You got to be going to a medical clinic. There is a little concept. They did introduce something called a singles bubble, where if you're living on your own, you're allowed to have one designated visitor to come to your place. Other than that, there is no visiting other people's houses. Simple as that. And you're only allowed to meet up to publicly gather with one other person outside. And I think that is exceptional for exercise. I do believe they lift the 2-person limit. I'll have to confirm that in the government document I have with me, which, by the way, I will be linking over time in the comments. But yeah, so all these different things they talk about. Oh, of course, going to work. So if you're an authorized worker, if you're an authorized worker and your work's still going outside, then you are allowed to leave your house. But the 2 most concerning, this is all tyrannical. This is all outside the state's jurisdiction. But the 2 most shocking blanket restrictions, particularly in my area. So I'm within one of these areas called a local government area of concern, and a local government area is basically a county. So you can think of it like that. Although probably a little bit smaller than a county, but still, I'd say roughly equivalent to a county. So if you're in one of the local government areas of concern in Sydney, most restrictions apply to all of Sydney. But if you're in one of the local government areas of concern in Sydney, you simply aren't allowed to travel outside of your local government area. Simple as that. For the most part, that's the case for all of Sydney. You're not allowed to travel outside of your county.
How many square kilometers or miles? I'm not sure what you use. How far can you go?
So I couldn't give a number like that, but I will say that it's
like a radius or something like that.
Yeah, so I'd say a diameter of a local government area. It's a matter of, depending on the one, it's a matter of tens or even less than 10 kilometers diameter. And also that's it. The other restriction for basically everything, you are not allowed outside your local government area, and you are not allowed outside of 5 kilometers from your home. So effectively, the total limit of travel is a 5 kilometer radius from your home. You're not allowed to go anywhere beyond that.
I'm pretty sure you're more free in China right now than you are.
Oh yeah, 100%.
Australia.
Yeah, 100%. You are people who say, and that's a personal comment from me. People who say that it's no longer true to say Australia is a free country. We're not. Simple as that. Even if you're a shill who supports these measures, you can still at least consistently say no, we're not a free country. So yeah, simple as that. It's not free. It's bad.
So suicide rates, mental health. How are things going with people?
Well, I can say from personal experience, it doesn't go well. It very badly affected me recently, but by the grace of God, I am getting help from friends and mentors and so on and so forth. But it was very, very bad. Everything piling on. Exact statistics are very hard to come by. So, like suicide statistics, just by their nature, they take a very long time to come about and to be compiled and all that. Not to mention the whole issue of causality. That's a whole other can of worms right there.
Yeah,
but
I understand. Well, you could see excess. You know how like I don't know in your country we calculate excess deaths. So like for a given year, you would expect per 100,000 people X.
Yeah.
So if it's normally 3 suicides per 100,000, and then you suddenly see 8.
Yeah.
Or I'm just pulling numbers out of my head.
Yeah. So I actually what I'd expect. I remember seeing this very interesting study on Japan's lockdowns, where and it carried out for other nations, at least for the first part. So in initial lockdowns in many countries, including Japan, suicides actually went down. But with this study, they focused on Japan. They kept on going. With Japan's second lockdown, they suddenly spiked. Very, very interesting. I had the link, but it's very curious why that is. And of course,
I think I know what that is. I think I could.
I think we can.
This is. I mean, I'm not comparing the two. Okay, I'm comparing the two. I'm not making an equation. I remember. For the first 9 years of my working career, I would drive like an hour a day, an hour each way to work. Okay. And then I got another job where I took the train. So I didn't have to drive. Still about an hour each way, but it involved walking and sitting on a train and not rush hour traffic and stuff like that. So then once you have to, then I got a job again where I had to do it again. And then mentally it was, when you get into the grind, but then you have the release and then you do the grind again.
Yeah, that does make sense. Yeah, that does make sense.
I think that's what's going on. So mental health, let's just say your general idea is people aren't doing well, I would assume.
That is generally the case. And I can definitely tell that from all my social circles. Like everyone, it's not a matter of if, but degree. It's not a matter of if people are doing badly, it is by how much. Some people are not as bad as others. Some people are coping with it okay. Other people I know, including some friends, are getting seriously badly affected by it. And I honestly, a couple of days ago, I would have put myself in that camp. It was very, very bad and hard on me, especially because I already had disciplinary problems.
I wouldn't blame anyone. I mean, obviously, depends how you react. Like, you don't want to absolve people of like all blame whatsoever. But
that's right. Yes.
You can only kick a dog so long, and then not expect it to bite you or something like that. Like obviously human beings are meant to be in social contact with each other.
That's right.
They're designed for social contact with each other. So if you break God's design,
that's right.
That's not going to be good.
And that's partially why the protests that have happened in Australia, they were really big protests. We're talking thousands upon thousands upon thousands of people here in Australia. So there was one a few weeks ago, maybe a month or so ago now, here in Sydney, like especially in the heart of Sydney, in the central business district. It was big, very, very big. I even saw like the helicopter footage from the news, and there was probably well over 20 or so thousand people. So it was a massive protest.
Well, given the lockdowns,
that's right. Yeah. And of course, and now what happened in response to that, the police launched a specific operation with like a dozen plus full-time detectives put full-time onto just finding as many people as they can who attended that protest, and issuing out fines, and on organizers have been arrested in multiple areas across Australia for organizing protests. Melbourne also had a huge, very, very big protest, thousands of people, and there's even footage. I can probably find it and link it after the fact, but there's even footage of how the police set up a massive blocked line, just dozens and dozens of police in a line, multiple lines thick, and even with police on horse. And there was just the massive crowd of the protest just right at the edge of it, just coming face to face with them. Eventually, the protests actually, because Melbourne has gotten it very bad in Victoria. So my state, New South Wales, directly below us is Victoria. They had it worse. They have been in lockdown for over 200 days now. With constant extensions by the premier, or so America, that's governor, by the premier Daniel Andrews. He's constantly be extending it. Not even saying we're going to be in lockdown for 200 days, but they'd say like, okay, we're going to release them this week. Oh, no, we're going to extend it. No, we're going to extend it. We're going to put a curfew. We're not going to have a curfew now. We're going to have a curfew, and they've been hit very, very bad. And I even have a friend.
Do they realize it's never going away?
I think more and more people are realizing that, and that's why there are like there's definitely considerations of like much I civil disobedience and civil resistance happening at some point. I don't think it's a matter of if but when, and I think the governments know that. I genuinely think that the premiers in particular, they don't want this to go on forever because they know what will happen if it does. They know the absolute chaos that will break out. And I was going to mention, we got a hint of that with Melbourne with their very recent protest, because as I was mentioning, huge police line blocking off the protest, and the protest actually smashed through it. Like they stopped for a bit and then they actually charged through the line and just routed the police entirely. Now, after the protest, of course, the police would go on, they would arrest people and all that stuff. And there were quite a few arrests there. But nonetheless, the people in Melbourne, which is the capital city in Victoria, they got so fed up. They actually charged down a police line. And it was, if I'm honest, it was quite a beautiful sight because in the end, what we're talking about now is to be ever so slightly tangential. It's not a matter of how do I describe it? The police in the end right now are the enforcement arm of tyrants. Simple as that. I was going to ask, and this is on my list of things to ask mentally. And for me, in this pandemic, I've come to the conclusion where I feel really naive, where I didn't realize the police are just going to follow orders. Yes.
People want their salary. Even if they're sympathetic to you, they're going to follow orders. Has your view of have police in general or authority changed, even like psychologically or emotionally? I know we were due to submit to authority. I granted how that plays out.
Most abused theological concept. I definitely
understand.
Even if only a little bit. But yeah, I'd say my view has changed and it hasn't. So it hasn't insofar as I've always had the idea that if the state's going to be tyrannical, the police is going to follow suit. That's just a matter of fact. But it has changed insofar as my opinion on the ground has gone from respect for our police force in New South Wales to absolutely zero respect. I have absolutely no regard for our police. Of course, I will follow even unreasonable orders just to be prudential, because I believe God does have a greater mission for me in other sectors. But other than that, I have absolutely zero respect for our police force at all. And there's even a ton of recorded footage, especially by an Australian here in Sydney, a guy called a YouTube channel called Aussie Cossack. He's constantly recording his encounters with the police here in Australia. And for the most part, they're brainwashed. Simple as that. It's just, I'm just doing my job. This is the health order, blah, 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 blah. That's all it is. You can give the most reasonable responses. You can even show that they're wrong, even when we grant the unreasonable and dumb policies of the government, and they'll still keep carrying on. They've had the police force here in Australia, in New South Wales and Victoria in particularly, they are on massive power trips, huge power trips.
Yeah, to me, it's one thing to know what's going to happen ahead of time. Like, I became a Christian I would like to apologize to all the Left Behind folks for thinking you were silly years ago. Even if that dispensationalist stuff is not my eschatology. The whole Mark of the Beast stuff seems way more plausible than it did 5 years ago or so. But so let's just say the degradation of Western culture or something like that. I knew it was coming. I didn't know how rapid it would be, but to actually be there for it and to see Romans 1 in action with people's minds being darkened is quite another thing. It's quite another thing to behold. It's one thing it's one thing to intellectually know my uncle by marriage was in the Holocaust, and I've spent a lot of time studying the Holocaust and how the German population went along and all. And it's one thing to know that's inside everybody's human heart, and it's another thing to witness, they get what they deserve, or the Jews being health issues. And if that does that make sense? It's another thing to behold.
That makes 100% sense. I don't know if you can comment on that now, but I wonder how many Christians who capitulated to the German government cited Romans 13. I wonder. Would you know anything about that, or would that be something to look at in the future?
That would be something I would look at. I mean, obviously, we're talking Germany was pretty infected with theological liberalism. Even Bonhoeffer, for all his good things, was a neo-Orthodox. He wasn't really Orthodox.
Yeah, that's something. But I have to sympathize with that so much. I've consciously thought of that myself, where like I knew this stuff was coming. I knew it exists elsewhere. But then, of course, actually experiencing it, it's not like it exceeded my expectations or anything, but it's just experiencing it is qualitatively different from knowing it in the abstract. Because like my knowledge of what this was going to be like in the theoretical future, in the abstract, I'd say it lines up very well with what I'm experiencing now. But experiential knowledge is just, by its nature, it hits you really hard, and it's incredible. And maybe the closest thing to a change in expectation for me. But even then, it was more or less still along this lines. It's just the magnitude of it is what kind of caught me off guard. Is just how many people, again, people who call themselves Christians, support this vocally and publicly. That's the incredible part. Although you can find big precedent for that in pre-World War II Germany, I guess, as well. But still, it's quite something to experience.
So I heard, was it New South Wales or something, that they're going to have an app that you have to check in and you have 15 minutes to respond.
Okay.
Is that stuff true? Or I just wanted to, since that's making the rounds.
So I looked this up myself. So this was from the Atlantic. So it's not a, even though it is lamestream.
By the way, the Atlantic is not radically, but on the left end of the spectrum. So for that article to appear, that was. I'm going to let you talk a little, and then I'm going to let my cat in because he likes to claw the door. So you keep going and talking, and I'll catch this portion in rewind.
all good. So for everyone watching, to put it in short, the prime source I found for this was The Atlantic. I don't know if they actually cited anyone for it, but given that they're a mainstream platform, even if they do twist things as mainstream platforms do, it is very, 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 very rare, not impossible, because it does happen, but extremely rare for them just to outright make up stuff. And in the context of this article, the article was actually asking if Australia is really a liberal democracy anymore. So it wasn't any kind of propaganda, a so-called propaganda piece, as you might think of it. But it was quite soberly reporting on this. So I can assume that it's true. But they basically describe that it's currently being tested right now. So it's not rolled out yet. But apparently there is an app being tested for South Australian residents in quarantine. So people who are confirmed to have the COOF, and they will have this in the hypothetical future. They will have this app, and they have to update their position with photographic proof, photographic facial proof, every 15 minutes to the government. So basically, you can't leave your phone. And if you don't check in the appointed time, then cops will be sent to you. Of course, there's the question of like how on earth they're going to have the logistic ability for the logistic response for the inevitability when thousands upon thousands upon thousands of people don't check in the 15-minute interval. So I'm hoping, and I'm also suspecting that it may just be left in the testing phase. If they don't like at least radically change it somehow. But that's basically all I know so far. It's only a hypothetical right now.
Can you, as a Christian, just not check in so you can preach the gospel to the cops every 15 minutes?
Modern problems require modern solutions. I would love that.
So before we transition to the church, this will be a natural segue. So things sound pretty bad. In Australia is the comment. And if anybody wants to ask any questions, just we'll
and if I may mention as well, last thing. So I mentioned two massive things that are especially tyrannical that's happening right now. One of them, as I mentioned, was that you cannot go outside of your county, your local government area, nor beyond 5 kilometer radius from your house. The second thing, and this is specific for the LGAs of concern, which includes me, and also I think it's happening for Victoria right now, but the times might be different. There is a curfew. So you are not allowed in my area and many areas around me, you are not allowed outside of your house between the times of 9 p.m. and 5 a.m. So, it is with all those time and travel restrictions, we are, it's just a fact. We are a functional prison right now. We just, the default place, the only place we are allowed to have any freedom of movement is our own house. And any time outside of your house is exceptional and should be considered something like a recreational time. It is functionally a prison right now. That's just a matter of fact. So yeah, curfews, we have that.
If you wanted to leave the country, could you?
No. Unless you're one of the unless you're a very special person like the Premier of Queensland who was allowed to leave the country for the Tokyo Olympics. But other than that, if you're not a very special person, if you're just an ordinary person, then you're not above the law. Other people are, but you're not.
So you're essentially a prisoner in your country.
More or less. Yep, more or less. You're not
allowed to leave 5 kilometers from your house, and if you want to escape the situation, you'd have to flee like you're in North Korea. Yeah,
that's right. I will say, however, media and government releases, what they rely on the most for their control is fear. So they know for a fact that many of these things are just not logistically enforceable for the large part. So, for example, traveling along your local government area, there are main artery roads going in and out of there, and I just saw yesterday myself. There are hundreds and hundreds of cars going through those every minute, and there are no police checkpoints. So the only way you can actually be caught right now for going beyond your LGA, there are exceptions. So like there's an area somewhat near me called Fairfield, and that's like the hotspot of hotspots. That's the area of concern of areas of concern. And they have, for checking up people in quarantine, they have the army assisting the police right now. So there are military personnel in the streets in Fairfield in Australia right now. But either way, with the possible exception of that, they just don't do police checkpoints for the most part. They logistically can't because these are main artery roads. So they say it's illegal. It is illegal. So if there are cops there and they decide to check you out, for example, they decide to ask you, which is part of the policy, by the way, you are mandated by these health edicts to provide ID and to provide a reasonable excuse for being outside. But other than that, if a cop checks you out and you are beyond the 5 kilometer limit of your home as they check on your ID, or if you're outside of your LGA, they can give you fines of multiple thousands of dollars. And this stuff's in the documents as well with various links from the New South Wales government website. So in theory, it is very repressive, very tyrannical, and it is for a large part. In practice, however, it's impossible for them to force on at least in every case, let alone on the vast majority of cases. But with respect to airports, I can't leave the country. So
I live a couple miles from like a famous gym who has defied the edicts of the local governor, and Attila's gym or something like that in Belmar, New Jersey. That's very close to where I am. And one thing I notice is that, he's getting pounded with fines and legal actions and all. It's because you would need everybody to uprise at once to make, if that happened,
Mm.
they couldn't do anything.
Mm,
But if
that's
one
right.
person or a handful of people do it, then they can make an example out of them.
That's right. Yeah, that's
Yeah.
right. That's a big part of their strategy, to divide and conquer, to make sure people are separated as much as possible, so that common movements are very hard to do. They still happen. There's still the sporadic protests here and there, but for the most part, they definitely try to keep people very divided.
All right. So what's the pop? I don't know if there's any polls or something that you trust or that you've seen, but what's the general population breakdown? What's the zeitgeist? Can you tell like what the support is or?
Yeah.
Or,
So I think I saw a poll a while ago. I think that actually showed that a majority of Australians support some form of restrictions. I think it was misleadingly used, because people equated that to support for these hardcore lockdowns. And at least with respect to my area, so all my social circles, even regular people when I'm out and about, doing my government approved activities, so like exercise or going to the shops, whatever, if I just so happen to hear anyone talk about it, or we get into like a spontaneous conversation, like I was just at Macca's yesterday, McDonald's yesterday with my brother, when we were passing through to get food, and we're just talking about this stuff out loud. And one other guy, just waiting for his food as well, he was like, "Oh, they have these, they're having these restrictions. You have to be vaccinated to work in the post office and all." And he was talking about it negatively. And I've had multiple instances like that. So at least in my area, with respect to my area, talking to the common man on the ground, which includes a lot of my friends and even a bunch of randos, it's overwhelmingly negative, especially because it is a known fact that our area is consciously singled out, because we have hotspots, but also because we tend to be more resistant than the rest of Sydney. Because with the areas around me and where I am, we are very multi-ethnic. We're more multi-ethnic than basically the rest of Sydney, especially with populations like Lebanese, hello, me, Assyrians, Arabs, Chaldeans, you name it. Those kinds of group, the trouble groups, which I love at this moment. They cause more of a ruckus than other groups elsewhere. So that's why we're being singled out, which is great, absolutely great. You see a lot of us, especially look, and that's the credit I have to give to Catholic and Orthodox believers who are specifically like ethnic. They are some of like the frontline kind of people, basically kind of pushing resistance on this stuff. They're very good. They're very zealous. But other than that, we can see at the same time. So there is technically restrictions on Greater Sydney as well. But you can find video footage and video footage and other accounts of people just loitering, hanging outside in. So our areas, for example, we have more affluent areas, so like eastern suburbs and northern beaches. So those are the more affluent and quite white areas of Sydney. They technically have there are the Greater Sydney restrictions, which are almost identical to the LGAs are concerned, except for big things like extra travel restrictions and the curfew. They don't have the curfew on Greater Sydney, but you can find videos and personal accounts of people in these more affluent areas loitering, hanging about in front of cafes. So they're nowhere near as policed as us here. That probably has changed recently, given the extra crackdown on businesses, but that wasn't too long ago at bare minimum, where you could see footage of people while we're being locked down hard under the boot here. You could see people in affluent areas basically living life like normal. And I think that is still the case right now. If you were to ask someone in the areas, Northern Beaches or the Sutherland Shire, that's also another very affluent area, then you can probably ask them, hey, can you step outside to your shops and show me what it's like? It'll probably look a lot different to what we have down here. I'll just say that.
I would assume Australia is much more leftist than America. is so the general population, the people in the cities, the normal suburbs, say maybe not in your more ethnic area, are they more supportive of all this?
I mean, I would obviously have to say just because of the orders of magnitude difference between Australia and America's population, not to mention the scale of difference between the same amount of geographical area. I'd have to say that it would definitely depend on the state, but I'd say with the aggregate of the United States, we are far more leftist, progressive, and anti-God. It's mainly, of course, in our city areas. But then you go out to the country, and my own brother, so he's a tradie, or a tradesman, a carpenter. He's a carpenter.
I've heard the term due to social media in the last few weeks, tradie. So
good. You're cultured. So and so he did a job stint a while ago where he actually was
blue collar worker
into the country. That's right. Yeah, he's a blue collar. So he's a real Australian. He was sent out into the country in multiple areas to do various jobs. And he tells me the experience itself that country area is basically real Australia. The people there, lovely, very, very conservative, very, very down to earth. So obviously, and as far as I know, that's kind of the same with America, where when you go to rural areas, people are more real. They tend to have their heads more screwed on than people in the city, for example.
You see that
basically the same here.
You see that phenomenon in movies all the time, where let's just take Star Wars. Like, okay, just take the original trilogy of Star Wars. That the good guys are wearing brown. The bad guys, this is a theme that goes back in literature forever. That but we see this in the Bible too. Is that
that's right?
Evil. It must be because when human interact with each other in great numbers, that it almost collects evil, or maybe has more of a satanic influence or something like that. But the rural people are the good people. Now, granted, as Hollywood has gone more leftist or something, they're the backwards.
They spin that as a bad thing. Yeah.
But in traditional like motifs and stuff,
that's right. Yeah, it's the trope. And when you just think about it, it doesn't really take that much thought. Like, people can be very obsessed with trying to make extremely in-depth academic theories and all this stuff. But honestly, it really is just so simple. At least in one aspect, where when you're living rural town, there's you know less people by definition, but you know them more intimately, and you're forced to actually do quite a bit of work on your own part to actually keep yourself sustainable.
You can't be an island.
That's right. Yeah, you can't be an island. You actually have to have you actually have to be someone with skin in the game. So unlike in the city, you can't afford to be some airy fairy some airy fairy artist who lives in an apartment penthouse down in the central business district, where your actual contribution to society is quite literally nothing except visual production, if even that.
Have you ever
things spread in a bad way?
Have you ever heard of? Do you know the term light pollution? Light pollution.
I know literal light pollution.
Well, light pollution is just the street lights and everything.
That's right.
So you can't see stars and stuff.
Yeah,
I'm wondering if it's things like that make people more atheists. Is that even if they wouldn't become Christian or whatever, that when you're not in touch with nature as much, when you don't see the stars in all of God's glory, if I walked outside. 30 years ago, I live outside Philadelphia. I could see a bunch of stars, not a ton, but I could see a bunch of stars. If I went outside tonight, I could see maybe 5. And I can actually see the glow of Philadelphia like permeate the sky. And I'm wondering if that, it's just little things like that subconsciously where God's glory gets veiled a little bit to people.
It's so weird. I haven't thought of that, but thinking of it now, that's just intuitively so obvious to me. I can even. That makes absolutely perfect sense. Like, even if it's not like a decisive thing, like they look at the stars. Oh, now I believe in God. But that I 100% think that would have. Now that I think about it, have an effect, because people just don't like they literally can't appreciate majesty right in front of them. They can see stuff in online pictures, but obviously that's not the same as seeing it yourself. I can even point to a personal experience. So my area is I'd say I could probably see more stars than you. So you can see quite a few stars in the sky where I am, because I'm out in the more suburban area. Not really near the main city, or I'm quite close to a major city, Parramatta, which is kind of like a satellite Sydney in Sydney, but it's not in the scale of a huge main city like the CBD, or let alone New York or places in America. But there is still enough light pollution, and I did not realize how much there really was still here, even though it's not as much as you, because you can still see quite a few stars, quite a decent number of stars in the sky where I am. But I didn't realize how much light pollution there still is here until I once went on a road. Well, I wouldn't really call it a road trip. It was meant to be just a one-night thing. But me and a few cousins and a few friends, cousins and some friends, we were going down. We were specifically going down to these tunnels. I forgot what the area exactly is called. Picton, that's it, Picton. So we're going down to what's called the Picton Tunnel, which a lot of people basically say they're like a haunted tunnel, like ooh and all that. And so we were intending on going down there like right in the dead of night. And it's in a more rural area, closer to the city called Wollongong, which is outside Sydney. And as we were going down there, the streets get very, very dark because we're going into more country area now. Which was part of the spookiness of the ride, because that's like some roads, especially as one long strip, there were just no lights at all. We eventually decide just to stop on the side of the road. Like there's little this kind of like little gravel patch that kind of went in, you could turn into in your car. We decided to just go there just to have a little bathroom break, so to speak. I go there, I'm doing my business on the side, and I look up, and it is. And I'm taken aback instantly of just the absolute explosion of stars just all over the sky, extremely, extremely dense, like hundreds to thousands and thousands of stars right above me. I look up and I'm just like to my cousins and mates, guys, look at that. Look at the stars. It's literally just like just the instant wonder of stars with zero light pollution.
Yeah,
I mean, never expected that.
I at one time wished to go to the southern hemisphere so I could see different stars, but now I just want to go somewhere where I can see stars.
Yeah. Honestly,
I probably wouldn't recognize the northern hemisphere ones. I can't even tell you the last time I saw the Big Dipper. Okay, so let's transition off of this esoteric stuff, and then we'll have our segues every once in a while to pretend we're smart, and then what's going on with the church? So, given all that background, let's transition to obviously the church can't meet, right?
No, we can't.
Church is
no
not
meeting
allowed
in
to
churches.
meet.
Nothing. No.
Now,
for a large part,
I just want to give a little background to me. So, I have a transplant, so I would be considered super high risk,
right?
Except unless you're like 95, I'm in one of the higher risk categories. So my church has been trying to go along with the state as much, but even in a liberal state like New Jersey, they've been allowing church services with mass or social distance, and restrictions have been lifted, and it hasn't been too horrible. And I've been to church a few times, and anytime I can find a church service that's outside, I've been going to. And but my elders know my situation, and I'm like, hey, like, this is my situation. So they're like, it's under the guidance of my elders and stuff like that.
Yeah.
So,
right.
So I just want to just kind of put that out there, where I'm at. So I don't want to sound like hypocritical or anything of anyone. But that said, having a church that's trying to navigate everything is one thing. Having a church that makes allowances for members who are high risk is one thing. Yeah, but you guys aren't even allowed to meet at all.
No,
you're not even allowed to meet out. You're not allowed to meet outside.
That's right.
Where you have infinite ventilation. So you can't even meet social distance
No, none of that.
Outside.
So there were restrictions last year and into early this year where their places of worship, they kind of fluctuate in restrictions. Places of worship were allowed to meet, but they would have restricted numbers. You had to wear a mask. You had to only X amount of people per square meter. So it was kind of, in my opinion, it was bad then because the church was just immediately capitulating to state regulations on church matters. But at least we were allowed to meet back then. And then a little bit after, I'd like to say a bit into June, because I remember I just finished my my second teaching practical when almost immediately after, like a week after, these massive, instant, huge restrictions came down, like the main bulk that we're still in today. Eventually churches just weren't allowed to meet at all. Most places with a physical presence were closed, not allowed to go there. So there's no like nightclubs. Strip clubs are open. Strip clubs are open as far as I'm aware. But
what?
Oh yeah. I kid you not. It's actually in the. There's a document. The government document. Sorry, no, they're not. Sorry, I got that wrong. I read the wrong thing. Strip clubs are not open right now. Instant fact check on myself. Calm down, Facebook. You don't have to fact check me. Calm down. But no, strip clubs aren't open. But you can go to places like what we call the Bottle-O, or just what do you call stores where you buy alcohol in the States?
Liquor stores.
Liquor stores, yeah. So you can go to a liquor store.
There might be there's regional differences in America, but yeah. I am a craft beer person at a liquor store. That is a part-time gig for me sometimes, and
nice.
It's okay. I'm Presbyterian, not Baptist. But I do view churches as essential, but when people is like, well, why is one? If liquor stores closed down and they had lockdowns, things would explode.
That would be bad. So on the practical metal, if
I'm not saying that is a good thing, like,
it's not, but it shows hypocrisy. It's not like we're not saying that, as long as churches are closed, therefore we should also close liquor stores. Definitely not. 100% when you say that, especially with Australia, which is notoriously high for its alcoholism, it would go very bad. Rather, what we're saying is look at what they consider a priority, alcohol being open, and they do not consider spiritual matters to be anything of any worth.
Because all they're concerned, all their let's highlight this.
Yes, that is true. Yes, prostitutes are allowed to go to see clients one-on-one.
That combined with the alcohol stuff just sounds like what it is that they know those two things are necessary for society, for society not to implode.
That's right. Yeah, kind of like Saint Augustine's reasoning, where he would say that prostitutes, though sinful and evil, it's a thing just to manage a sinful society. It's the issue with us is not that. For one, I would love strip clubs and all that to close, but that's a totally different topic. But if you believe these things are necessities, so looking at the liquor store, right, that's a more reasonable one. If you believe that is a necessity, because otherwise the issues that would arise from closing those, chaos, hell, a lot of damage, and yet you don't consider that depriving people of communal spiritual life will have a bad effect. If you don't think, if the state just portrays how godless and honestly just how unintelligent and stupid that they are on a collective level, that they don't consider corporate spiritual matters of anything of worth.
Well, that's what I'm saying, where they don't even allow, like, hey guys, like, meet outside. They can't even make a common sense allowance for groups of people to meet in an area where we've known since last April, like a month in or 2 months in, that it's primarily about ventilation. We've known that. And then people are going to so our governor started restricting stuff about going to the park. Like, I mean, but he eventually lifted it. But when he lifted it, he was like, be smart and don't, like we're kids and he's our mom or something, like, don't make me like put this back on.
Oh yeah,
I mean
that's right.
that's
Yeah,
like 1/100th of a thousandth of what you guys are going through, but it's the
yeah,
same
that's
sort
right.
of mentality. Now, I need to backtrack before we do the church stuff. I see a lot of conservatives in America when they hear the Australian thing is like, you guys gave up your guns X amount of years ago. Is there any truth to that, or do you think that wouldn't have affected anything
Doubtlessly.
if the population was armed?
To qualify it first, and I think in the United States you can see that, especially in certain areas. But you can have all the gun rights you want. You can be allowed to own. You can be allowed to own a flipping like a military issue M14. You could be allowed to own grenades, tanks, whatever. If your people don't actually have a spirit of self governance and self preservation, it's useless. So if you can have like a flipping nuclear warhead with you right now, but if you don't have the spirit to use a nuclear warhead, it may as well not be there. So I would say yes, but yes, we gave up our guns. That was, in my opinion, huge mistake, huge error, because now the state is able to do all these things they're doing right now with very little repercussions. But
well, maybe you gave them
also,
up because you didn't have the spirit.
Precisely. That's the core issue right there. A lot of people, especially outside of Australia, and honestly, even a lot of Australians they like to think Australia has a rebellious spirit because we're convicts. No, we're not. We actually have a very sheepish spirit. Because we were convicts originally. We came in here being herded by law enforcement. Now,
Well,
of course,
I heard someone say you're not only descended from the prisoners, you're also descended from the jailers.
I've heard that too, and it is so brilliantly true. The curious thing, though, is that if you're looking at country people, for example, they tend to be much more independently minded, much more resistant to overly bad stuff. But ultimately, they don't really have that same self-governing, idealist spirit of like the American ruralists, for example. But again, I have to bring it back to the ethnics. It's the center of resistance and self-preservation is with the ethnics here in Sydney, especially, and in Melbourne. Melbourne has a huge Greek population who are probably helping this stuff out a lot. But yeah, it's ethnics who are the primary drivers of resistance to government tyranny right now here in Australia. If you go to any massive protests today, if you were to go to any of those major protests, like more or less the majority of them would be white, just by the nature of, well, Australia is a majority white country for now. But if you were to look at proportion-wise, you would see a lot more ethnics than you would expect given their representation in Australia's population. Ethnics have a much greater spirit of at least just self-preservation, not like the idealist level of the United States, but
is it because they're
more
newer
so than
or something?
To a degree, yes, but also because we come from nations, and I like to say we because, of course, I'm one of them. I'm my mum's side. They come from nations that have experienced, to some degree or less, tyranny, warfare. So they have some battle scars. They have some guts to be able to stand up to people trying to bully them into submission. So yeah, that helps out.
Our Cubans, it's like our Cuban refugees and immigrants.
Yeah, that's what I've seen a little bit about that as well. They're pretty cool from what I've seen. But yeah, to bring it back to that, yes, giving up our guns was a big mistake and definitely a factor. But the primary cause of that was the fact that we just don't have a spirit of self-governance and self-preservation against an overreaching state. We don't have that, and that's what's allowing us to be trampled underfoot today. And what makes it worse is not just the apathy from that, but also some people who are enthusiastically such. So people, especially people who call themselves Christians. So many, obviously, tons and tons of non-Christians who are pushing this crap, but also a lot of people who falsely call themselves Christians, who enthusiastically promote this stuff and actually condemn their brothers and sisters for daring to meet on the Lord's Day. That's where we're at right now. You will see, and I can even read some examples very soon. I copied them deliberately, of online comments from people who falsely call themselves Christians condemning their brothers and sisters for meeting on the Lord's Day because the government said no. We have that here in Australia. Because the government said no. Simple as that. Well, obviously they like to dress it up often in like, oh, it's a health thing, blah 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 blah. But a lot of their reasoning ultimately comes down to Romans 13. They will say that over and over again.
Oh, there's a lot of resources for dealing with Romans 13, so we won't hash that out here, but I know James White's gone over it a ton, and other people have. All right, so the church. So there's a lot of people within at least the visible church who,
Yeah.
just because the government says don't meet, don't meet.
Mm. Yeah,
I mean,
that's right.
is it? I mean, it's one thing, I guess, if like 80% of the people were dying, it's like Black Plague too.
Yeah, you can at least say that there's an argument for that. But even then, look at the Black Plague. What did Martin Luther do? Yeah, he met. He went to people. It's one thing. I have to bring it back to jurisdiction again. If a local congregation decided, okay, we're going to make the decision to enforce social distancing, we're going to have multiple services so that we can have less people in at a time, and maybe they even go the ridiculous route and say masks. You can say whatever you want about those measures. You can say they're dumb and stupid, whatever, but that is at least within the jurisdiction of the local congregation. That is not the same fundamental evil or fundamental error of the state enforcing this stuff on the local congregation. That's something different entirely. And as you mentioned with your own health thing.
Where would you put the distinction? Like, say the state said, we have these fire codes or something like that. There gets to a point where it's like you can't meet, where the difference in degree does become a difference in kind, where nothing is good enough. Where that's why I was harping on the you can't even meet outside point, was that it's one thing to have a thing is like, should you wear masks or not? The data is not particularly great pre-pandemic because they don't really want to test stuff on humans, and then not all masks are the same, right? There's surgical masks, there's cloth masks, there's N95, there's K whatever from Korea. Oh, my cat wants to leave now. You can talk for hum something. Hold on.
So, I will say that the difference that even with some government measures, even if I think they're all fundamentally illegitimate, there's still a difference of degree, at least. There can at least be a difference of degree, and maybe even in some cases a difference of kind. So we can think of when this first happened, for example, when they enforced a mask mandate and social distancing. We can say that is erroneous, is wrong, ignoring any issues of medical truth or whatever. You could still say it's wrong, illegitimate for the government to enforce that stuff. But on a prudential level, on a practical level, the church can still work around that to a degree. It got more serious when there were imposed limits on the number of people allowed in the service. That's an even greater degree of illegitimate use, because now you're denying. You're in effect denying many people the ability to meet on the Lord's Day, especially with smaller churches who simply don't have the resources to run smaller services. I believe that was even an issue mentioned in like American Christian articles from what I've seen. Just that massive impact of number restrictions on small churches, and that was certainly the case here in Australia. Now those were bad. Those were bad enough. They were seriously bad, but the church could still, on a practical level, work around it. I was disappointed with the very low level of resistance to that. I do know that there were some churches who tried to defy that to a degree, and I salute them. But for the most part, they followed along very, very diligently, which was very disappointing. It's a difference in degree, but the biggest difference in degree, of course, is when they just ban church outright. So I would personally argue that mandating certain numbers of people in a church and banning church outright is the same kind of error, but the degree difference is so vastly incredible that one of them can be on a practical level tolerated, and the other one is simply
my cat
a dividing
wants to
line.
Get back in. I'm going to leave the door cracked. Freaking cats!
Make up your mind, mate. What's his?
Let
what's
me
his
see
or her
if
name?
I can. His name. See him?
Yep, I do. What's his name?
Lionel Richie.
Lionel. Make a decision, mate.
Yeah, he's named after the 80s pop star. Hold on.
Okay, got ya. Edward says based cat. Actually, I'll wait to Jeff to get back. But yes, that is at least I hope that's a base cat. Just kind of to kind of use the modern language, the Sigma male cat just doesn't care what anyone thinks, just does whatever it wants. But
his main concern is that the door is closed.
Edward mentions a good point in the comment, right? So Edward Hearn, could you highlight his one on the courageous Catholic priest one? I I can personally say yes, because many of my friends, like a lot of my closest friends, are very traditionalist Catholics. So, that's kind of the funny thing. Me and Jeff, right? We both make this kind of content against Roman Catholic doctrine, but a lot of my closest friends are very traditionalist Roman Catholic, and I can say from certain statements by certain people I know that yes, this is happening. There are underground Catholic priests running underground mass in Australia.
Now,
I don't know exactly where, of course, and I wouldn't say that out loud, but as far as I know, it is happening. I can't say the same for Protestant pastors, at least insofar as my knowledge is concerned. To be fair, I do not know very many. I know very, very few level-headed, like people of our kind of thinking Protestants, people who would be doing this stuff and people who would know about this stuff. I don't know many of them, but just as far as my knowledge goes, I don't know of any Protestant pastors doing the same.
We're definitely. I was called an anti-Catholic bigot the other day on Twitter because he told me like Protestantism was filled with heresies. So, and I'm like, and then he's when I think traditional Catholics, are run afoul of the Judaizing heresy, then he's like, and so some Catholics go to hell. He's like, oh, you're an anti-Catholic bigot. I was like. So with that as a background, good on these Catholic priests. So good for them.
Yeah, 100%. And you know what? I will also mention. So this wasn't really underground. Yep, 100%. Good on these guys. They're much more courageous and acting more Christian than many otherwise doctrinally correct Protestants, which says many things. I will mention though that on the 22nd, so it wasn't really underground because they literally live streamed. They were just that level of Chad. There was a church in Blacktown, which is near me. There's a city called Blacktown, which is near me, and they physically met. None of the restrictions or whatever. Like this is just in the 22nd of October. They met physically, something like 60 attendees. And it looks like a primarily Islander church because in my area in particular, they're all just a little bit west of me. There's a big Islander population, and they're very very out there, outgoing ethnics. So that kind of helps too. But there's a lot of Islanders and some Africans. But anyway, this church met on the 22nd, on the evening of the 22nd. Just zero disregard, zero regard for the state's restrictions, zero regard for the state's claims. They looked like, at least from what I've seen of their like stuff that they kind of preach, they looked like one of those very, very hyper Pentecostal, charismatic, potentially even a name it and claim it kind. I don't think I heard directly name it and claim it, but the kind who would like say like in the power of Jesus. They
blur sometimes.
Potentially, I haven't seen anything direct to that, but just from statements things I'd see in their preaching, like in the name of Jesus.
Given my Pentecostal background, that sort of stuff blurs. Where I would say even people who I would consider genuine Christians in the Pentecostal background, a lot of that word of faith stuff sometimes blends in, unfortunately.
It can, yeah. So,
but at least they have a backbone.
That's the thing. So I can't. It's kind of tangential to mention whatever their name and claim. I haven't seen anything now, but they do like the very thing that's very typical of like the old school second wave Pentecostals, where like in the name of Jesus we declare this, we declare the power of Jesus, which is honestly that's great stuff. I mean, I'd still call myself a Pentecostal right now if with Reformed and other leanings, but they actually met. Whatever errors you think they have, they actually met. And they live streamed they live streamed it while they were meeting. But that is the backbone of backbones right there. So what happened? In trouble, or? Yes, they did. So they got caught, of course. Like they didn't even try to hide it. So like you can't say poor them or anything. Well, still poor them because of course that's the church being oppressed right there. They got caught and they have been collectively fined around $35,000. Every attendee got fined a big exorbitant amount, and the church itself, of course, got fined a huge amount, and they were broken up forcefully. And I say forcefully, I mean, like, of course, police were.
If nobody's working, then bill it to the welfare agency, and
that's right. And of course, certain media outlets, even, and I want to talk about them a little bit. Even this so-called Christian media outlet we have here in Australia called Eternity News, even they went out of their way to say that because they're called Christ Embassy Church, I believe. They even went out of their way, this so-called Christian publication, just to talk about an unrelated case from a while ago about how their mother congregation back in London was caught with basically financial crime issues, particularly with their pastor. So they decided to go out of their way in the story of this local church in Blacktown, Australia, Sydney, being broken up forcefully by the state for just adhering to the Lord's ordinances. And they decided to point out, oh, by the way, their mother church back in London did this financial crime. It's disgusting. And this is part of the Christian pile-up, so-called Christian pile-up on other Christians, people who enthusiastically support all this stuff. And if I may, I copied down some of the comments. So this is the website I'm talking about, guys. Look up Eternity News, Australian-based Christian news publication. And I copied their comment sections are almost every article, absolute cancer. They're what I would call part of this weird phenomena where they're not outright liberal and leftist. They'll pay lip service and sometimes even give an okay defense of conservative talking points like
sounds
on
like
marriage.
Christianity Today.
I'd say exactly like Christianity Today. So very milquetoast conservative with dangerous leanings on liberal areas. And I'd say just honestly, just straight up closet liberals in many cases. Some of them are a bit more blunt and explicit than others.
That's why people have been calling Christianity Today Christianity Astray.
That's 100% true. 100% true. So Eternity News, I can definitely say that. Eternity News here in Australia is Christianity Today. So if you know anything about that, you know Eternity News. Their comment sections are absolute cancer. Almost every single article on something that is somewhat controversial, you'll find absolute cancer, which is the awful takes. They recently, so they posted an article on this church being broken up in Blacktown, being fined $35,000. They posted that article and they shared it on their Facebook page. And here are just some of the comments that I copied down, and I'm going to read them out right here. First comment. Romans 13, 1-2, obey the government. Second comment, good, no church is above legally enforceable lockdowns, irresponsible actions by that church, and they deserve the full force of the law. Comment 3, as soon as pastors or others start declaring answers to prayer, they betray their complete lack of understanding of God's will. So God doesn't understand prayer. So God doesn't answer prayer. Okay. But to continue on with that same comment, the Bible tells us to respect our governments, which are God-given for our benefit. There is no excuse under heaven for openly defying the rules God has put in place, no matter how frustrating it may appear to be. God is still on his throne, and his will overwhelm us in his time. And don't forget, what's alleged defiance of the government here is meeting as the Lord's body. That's what this person's talking about. And their last
commanded, right?
Yeah. Exactly, yes. And honestly, you don't even need. It's like it is so pervasive. Like you won't find there's these same kind of people. Their main thing of hermeneutic is, find me an explicit verse that says you have to do this. Oh, you can't, therefore you don't have to. It is so pervasive in Scripture. The physical meeting of Christ's body all throughout Scripture, whether it's in the Old or the New Testament, it is so explicit and pervasive that it is so strong. It is a default. You do not even need and don't even need to expect an explicit command for it, because it is a given. It is a given that the Lord's body meets, because it is the body of Christ. And particularly whether you're real presence or not, we know for a fact that the Eucharist is a central meeting point of the body of Christ, something that can only happen face to face. You can't partake of the same loaf or the same wine if you are over Zoom. That's not church. And even someone I noticed, someone I really respect, made a great point where you think that Christ was so stupid as to not anticipate the idea of telecommunications for church. Despite that, he still assumed, like through the inspired authors, that the physical meeting of the body was normative. That's it. It is as simple as that. You can complain all you want. Oh, but we have modern technology now. So what? That's not what was commanded. The physical meeting of the body was commanded. It doesn't matter if you have what you think is an alternative means to meet. That's still what we have. So to bring that back to what we're saying, these people will have that kind of hermeneutic where they'll expect like an exact explicit Bible verse just to demonstrate something that the church has nonetheless observed continuously and without straying for thousands of years. And that's just how they operate. One final comment that I copied. You can still, and it's related to this, it's actually exactly on this. You can still worship at home in small groups. God will still hear you. You don't have to break the laws. Why commit a sin? And, well, in a large part, that comment is simply not true. You can't meet with other people in your home here in Sydney, New South Wales. You can't do that unless you're thinking of your own family, which my own family does it. So that's decent. But no, you otherwise can't do that. So that's just not even true. So those comments that I read there are a taste of the readership of this Eternity News / Christianity Today Australia edition. Yeah, it's and that attitude from people who call themselves falsely Christians is very pervasive in the online sphere. So we talked about a while ago about what's the general feel for the attitude towards these lockdowns and all that in the common man's down to earth area, at least especially in my area, overwhelmingly negative, especially amongst the ethnics. But then when you look at the especially like white boomer affluent so-called Christians, they are all over this. They are gobbling it up. They absolutely love it. Of course, there are exceptions demographically, but for the large part, that's what happens.
What do you think accounts for that? Is it the cycle? Are they afraid of death, or is it?
I think so. Yeah, I think fear of death is a big part of it because you can actually look at like their Facebook profiles and you'll notice a lot of these people making comments. Intuitively, you would think that they're younger, absolute leftists, heretics, but a lot of them are older. A lot of them are boomers, which is very interesting. And I think it is that fear of death, but also in the attitude of the older generation where they do generally have a much higher respect of government. And that unfortunately bleeds over into a very erroneous view of the state. So that combined with a fear of a virus, especially because they were like the brunt generation. They were the generation who received the brunt of the mainstream media explosion and pervasion, and how pervasive it went into our lives.
You know what's a good strategy is James Lindsay has this for critical race theory. Is that ahead of time, you need to tease out what and also talk to other people what your line is. So because you're going to get there incrementally, right?
That's right.
So if 5 years ago you said, "Hey, if I reach X, I know like this is unacceptable."
Yep. 100%.
But you got to get them. Yeah. You got to get them on record like ahead of time. Like, if this goes on,
that's true.
How long? If this, like you're saying, COVID's not going away, or sorry, COOF. Algorithms don't destroy me. COOF. If the COOF isn't going away, how long? How long is this acceptable? It's one thing if it was the first month or two and we don't know what's going on.
Yeah, that's right. Even if I think what they did is a jurisdictional overreach and violation, like especially with what they're still doing, where they actively suppress people's livelihoods. Even if that was the case, if it was just happening for the first month, I'd say that was bad. There should be consequences for that overreach. But on a practical level, whatever, it's there.
We got to get our medical stuff in order, and we got to get everything together and make sure we have enough oxygen. But to go on indefinitely, there was a goal shifting, shifting early on where it went from we're going to stretch this out so we don't overwhelm the system, at least
flatten the curve, et cetera,
to some elites or whatever went to like we have to go to zero.
Yeah.
And I think the experts knew that was never going to happen. So,
yeah, and I never like using that language myself, at least. Because the whole epistemic authoritarianism of the experts say this. No, I'm not saying you're saying this. But you just reminded me when you said the words "the experts." Like, oh my god, the amount of times people say this.
But they knew that.
But in this case, it's legit. Yeah.
Like they knew that ahead of time is that that we would never get to zero, and then they kind of switched to kind of, I don't know why. I don't know why. Instead of telling people like, hey, we gotta, manage this, then it was like, I think it was because there was a certain amount of elites. And I don't know if it was, it seems like the elites of different countries kind of are this amorphous blob, so it doesn't matter where. If you could pick out an elite from Sydney, London, New York, Los Angeles, Paris, Milan, Rome, Tokyo, and to me they're all the same. You know,
to a large part, maybe, yeah.
So for some reason, the elites went to, we're gonna not allow any spread whatsoever. Which in February of 2020, I knew this was. I'm like, oh, okay, they can't contain this, and I knew that you can't contain a respiratory disease.
Yeah, it's just ridiculous to think you
not
can.
one with a 2-week incubation period.
Yeah, and like it reminds me of when you mentioned much earlier, at the beginning, when you mentioned like the whole mark of the beast thing being more probable to you now. I think that in this case,
less crazy,
or less crazy rather, less crazy. And I think a good way to consider this. I reckon a good way to consider this is not necessarily that it's the mark. It's not that it's the mark of the beast. I think that there's still like criteria, especially. Sorry, that's my phone. But I think there's still some criteria we can see, like for example, with the ubiquitous spread of the gospel. Especially if you're a post-millennial, then this likely is not the mark of the beast. But I believe nonetheless that the great thing about the Book of Revelation and its warnings and other areas as well is that it also provides the types of things we need to look out for. So even if we are not, so the various things mentioned in the Book of Revelation, most of them have happened countless times throughout history, which makes it very useful as a guide for looking at the things that we should look out for in general. So while I would not say that the vaccines, I would not say now that the whole vaccine passport, vaccine whatever, or the what's the code word to not get you ratioed or whatever for the thingy, for the needle. Okay, so the needle. So I wouldn't consider those. I think it's vastly improbable that they're the mark of the beast, but they are right now a type of a mark of the beast. Where if you want, especially about to happen right now, because what they're about to introduce is that once there's a 70% fully vaccinated rate, because notice they don't say vaccinated anymore, they say fully vaccinated, then they're going to allow, in my state of New South Wales, they will then give, this is the government's own language, they will give additional freedoms to people who are fully vaccinated once there is a 70% mark hit in my state. So if you're not vaccinated, it's still going to be like this. If you're fully vaccinated, you're going to have some more freedoms. So it is right now, and in other places around the world, especially Israel, my word, what's happening there, it is a type of mark of the beast right now. It is a mark of the beast, of the current beast right now. So that's how I would articulate it.
Yeah, I think so. I would view Revelation in a partial preterist way, but then I've long been thinking, since I've taken that view in the last 20 years or so, that, oh, well, what if it's true? It's primarily about the first century, but there's repeated patterns throughout history, and maybe even at the end of history, it's those repeated patterns culminate.
That's basically my view. Yeah.
So maybe everybody's right.
Yeah, to an extent. Yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
Partial preterism, getting let go. When Jesus said this generation, he meant this generation.
Right. Yeah. There we go. Doors open, and Lionel, do you want to say hi to everybody?
Yes. Cato. Hello, Cato.
Dolly's here too. Hi, Dolly. Say hi.
Hello. Oh, yes, Doggo. I'm Doggo gang, if I may say.
Yeah. Okay, so I'm kind of out of questions. What's next for the church? And then
I reckon there's a few things that are very much worth mentioning. So there are a few actual legal actions that are about to take place. So the Supreme Court of New South Wales has just received a suit from a organization here in New South Wales, I think specifically in Sydney, called AFL Solicitors, and that stands for like the name partners, AFL. And they've just filed a suit specifically against the state of New South Wales, but also against Health Minister Brad Hazzard and against Chief Medical Officer Dr. Kerry Champ. And the suit is basically it's a suit against the legitimacy of the general actions that the health minister and the chief medical officer have taken, because like the medical officer is actually the primary guy who gives these policies alongside the chief medical officer, so not necessarily just the premier. But a suit is taken against them because certain jobs right now, and increasingly so, including my intended vocation of teaching, are requiring workers to be vaccinated. So that's the case with health workers, I believe, right now. Don't quote me on that, but it is the case for construction workers right now. They have to get the vax or have a medical exemption, which is a strict criteria if they want to have work, if they want to go to work. And even my own brother, he's, let's just say he's been affected by that. Let's just say that, because he's a construction worker. And that's about to become the case with teachers, which is teaching.
Well,
which
it's a
is
shame
my
that
area.
you can't just decide medically for yourself what's best, and it has to.
Yeah, or let alone you and your own GP.
It's almost like I don't. I got the Moderna shot because I'm in the high risk group. It made sense for me.
That's fair
but
enough.
I didn't have to decide like, well, they're tyrannically forcing me to take this. So do I take it? Do I want to take this even though? Am I acquiescing to tyranny? Does that make sense?
Yeah, that's a legitimate concern. But with you're in a high risk. I think it's like it doesn't really make a difference. But I guess to balance it out, you like, just for anyone in general who's in like your situation.
Well, I guess why I mentioned a high risk thing, because it's like I have to make the decision based on medical stuff.
Yeah, that's right.
And I'm just making a medical decision. And if someone else makes a different medical decision for themselves, that's fine.
Yeah.
But
it's their jurisdiction.
But it's not the same thing as now I got to decide whether I work or not, whether I can travel or not. That sort of thing. Does that make sense?
No, it does make perfect sense.
What did in Australia, are they having a mixture of shots, or are they doing the AstraZeneca?
Yeah, we have a mix of. I believe we are getting Pfizer. I believe we have primarily Pfizer and AstraZeneca. I believe AstraZeneca is the main one, though, if I remember correctly. Some of my friends, have gotten the AZ, as it's called. But I was also going to mention, so my teaching, my profession, teaching, where I'm going into. So schools are not meeting right now. They're not. They're all online, but they're wanting them to go back.
Sorry, I have to pause you here.
All good.
How much damage does that do to kids?
You have kids, Jeff. you probably know that even better than me, but I can definitely say the damage would be colossal. Like just knowing that, how just looking back to your own younger years, how that was like, those are key stages of development. And even still right now, I'm only 21. I'm only just hitting the end of the primary development. To have that enforced upon them is just straight up evil, and it will cause so much damage. I reckon a lot of the damage is not going to be seen immediately. We're going to be seeing my camera. Hello. There we go. A lot of the damage from this lockdown is not going to be seen for a while. In the coming years, once it's over, God willing, we're going to start seeing the stats in that. But yeah, the damage is colossal with that. But they are allowing schools to go back on November 8th here in New South Wales, with the caveat that all teachers must be double vaxxed. Straight up. Unless, of course, you have a medical exemption, teachers must be double vaxxed. That's it. If they're going to be going back to school, which of course is a problem, because I was intending by that time even, to have teaching work, to actually have employment. I'm still hoping, God willing, I can be employed in an online capacity. I think that may be possible, and I'll gladly do that. But that's having a real world effect on me. Teachers, once they go back into school from November 8th onwards, they will all be required to be double vaxxed, no exception. And there's a lot of teachers, hundreds to thousands, dare I say, in New South Wales who are like rallying against this stuff. I'm even part of a massive Facebook group of New South Wales teachers consolidating to get like legal advice and assistance for resisting these measures once school goes back in. So I'm kind of hopeful for that. The teachers unions, as far as I've seen, even the good one that I know of that I was intending on getting to, basically useless, not representing anyone. So it's pretty bad for the teaching area as well. That's happening. Yeah.
When are elections for you guys at the state and federal level?
You know, let me briefly look that up right now because I remember I was discussing this. It's either early next year. 2023. That's the next election for us.
Do they do the state and federal at the same time, or
no? They're different. They're distinct. So so they're gonna our premier, our health minister, the party in general, and that's the ironic thing. So here in Australia, like every Western nation, if you notice, they all have a two-party dichotomy, which is very interesting, and they often end up being two sides of the same coin. Australia here, we have the Liberal Party and the Labor Party. Labor Party is basically kind of like Canada's Labor Party and the UK's Labor Party. Like they're the left-wing side and all that, and traditionally pro-worker. And the Liberal Party here in Australia was basically our conservatives. Like they have typically, and they still do, have the hold on the conservative vote. But especially in recent, like last 2 or 3 years, they have openly supported homosexual marriage. They've openly supported abortion. In fact, our current premier right now, Gladys Berejiklian. So if you notice with New South Wales right now, we have some of the most liberal and open abortion laws rights in the world. And that was all put in one bill, which was co-sponsored by our own premier and forwarded by a lot of the Liberal, which was supposed to be Conservative party. So that we don't have in any of the major parties, there is no actual Conservative option. But anyway, the Liberal Party, the Conservative Party, whatever you want to call them, they're going to be able to run roughshod as much as they want throughout this year and even into next year if they want, which they're claiming they don't want to. But of course, they've changed the goalpost 12 times. And there's not going to be any consequences until 2023.
Are there any politicians speaking who represent like anti-lockdown stuff?
Yes, there are a few, mainly on the federal level. They're still in the minority, but even then they exist. So like, the big one I'm seeing right now is Craig Kelly. He has the kind of like level of loudness and rhetoric, which I don't like, which makes you like not look good. Like, you know, when you see like the crazy anti-vaxxer on Facebook and they just sound crazy through what they type, he can sound like that sometimes, unfortunately. But fact is, he is a member of the federal parliament, and he's pushing some stuff through. He's actually really trying to make some genuine attempts at like bills and all that, for example. So there's a few people. I think so. Our treasurer, Dominic Perrottet in New South Wales, he's more or less a normie who supports restrictions in general, but I do believe he is quite against the mass lockdown that we have here in New South Wales. And there was even talk recently of him trying to oust our current premier and take over. I don't think that's really gone anywhere yet, though. Apart from him and some other local politicians in the state parliament on like very minor parties. There's some resistance. There is some resistance in the political dimension, but not as much as would be liked.
Okay, I'm going to mention, because there's a little bit of a lag, if anybody has any questions in the live stream, to post them in the live stream in the chat, and we'll try to get to any of them. All right, so you have elections coming up. Doesn't sound like you have many politicians who you could vote for if you want to. You're not allowed to leave the country.
No. Not allowed to leave my state. Not allowed to leave my state.
You can't leave 5 kilometers.
No.
You're killing shelter animals. I heard the one incident. I don't know how widespread that is, but
it seemed restricted to that council, but it's still kind of pathetic.
Yeah. I guess if you're living in the middle of nowhere, you'd have more freedoms.
Yeah, that's right.
Most of Australia is right in that little bands, right? Those bands on the coast, on the East and West Coast.
That's right. Yeah, vast majority of our populations along those areas and in more built up. I'd say like if there was like a ratio of like city dwellers to rural people, I reckon it would be much higher for rural in the United States than in here in Australia. Like a huge amount of our population, like vast majority is focused in the cities and the suburbs where these measures actually have effect.
Yeah, I mean, our cities dwellers and suburban dwellers are probably the majority of the population too, but there are, it doesn't skew so insane. Just by its nature or something. All right, I'm trying to sit weird because of the cat, but here I'll just there you are. Oh, never mind. Okay. All right, so and then you have the church not being able to do anything.
Not being the church. Well, here's the thing.
But even if you could, then you would probably get ratted out by your fellow citizens and.
Yeah, that's right. The thing I find so pathetic and a massive condemnation of the church, and if anything, that's actually one benefit of these otherwise tyrannical measures. They've actually shown us a perfect snapshot of who are true believers and who are simply state-sponsored shills, who are, in the terms of John's gospel, who are the believers, present tense, and who are those who believed, aorist, past tense. With respect to John's gospel, we've seen a beautiful snapshot of that here in Australia, and honestly, I'm even thankful for that, even if it had to come through tyranny. Like it's so true, God working out all things for the good of those who loved Him. He's worked that out in order to actually he's used some of the most tyrannical measures in Western society's history to actually give the church a good snapshot of itself, which is totally invaluable knowledge.
It's hard not to see God's judgment on all this.
Oh yeah, 100%. Honestly, I've been reluctant to think it, but honestly, this is a judgment on society and even on the church for just how pathetic we've been doing things.
Society and the church, and it's a removal of God's word when the churches can't meet. So it's a removal of God's word from society.
That's right. Yeah,
it seems like it's a judgment on the church and society in general.
That's right, 100%.
Both at the same time. Yeah,
I've had it very much out. Like this is part of my. This is kind of part of my like mentally downhill stage not too long ago, barely a week, like only a few, but like from a couple of weeks ago down to barely a few days ago. I had it out really bad to an intense level against pastors and priests who willingly refuse to meet underground. And I lashed out mentally and in some cases verbally, quite badly, like not directly at one because I can't see any, but just to myself. But then my friend actually gave me a very good perspective, something to remember that I was not considering. That in his own experience, the pastor, I do believe he said the pastor would potentially be willing to meet underground. I don't think he gave a definitive answer on that, but it's the congregation that all said no, we're not going to meet. So it's not just the pastors. There's so many. We can tell already there are so many. Faithless. That's what it is. Faithless pastors who are not willing to defy the state and to carry out the most essential of services, and that is the gathering of the Lord's body. More essential than physical food. More essential than, dare I say, surviving a certain bacteria. a coof. And that's not to say go out and willingly get infected. No, God, no. The church has
the church. If you're feeling sick,
that's right. Yeah, we're still a physical presence in the end. Be prudential, be good, manage yourselves well in that way. But if we're going to compare things, if we're going to pit one thing against another, the church is the most essential service you can get. And for a pastor to willingly say that we will not meet, that we will obey Caesar. As well as the congregation to even say that we will obey Caesar, we will render unto Caesar what is God's. That right there, I have said, is a dividing line right there. And I don't know your take, Jeff. In my own personal opinion, I'd hope you'd agree, but I am of genuine conviction. Like it's time to honestly admit the difficult takes, things that would make us uncomfortable, but nonetheless which are true anyway. It is my genuine conviction that if a pastor willingly, so on the order of the government, willingly chooses to comply and support these bans on the church, on the Christ's body gathering, and likewise for any laymen who go along and support it. So not merely going along out of pressure or because they physically cannot meet for some reason, but people who willingly support this stuff, a so-called Christian who willingly supports the state's right to ban the church from gathering on medical grounds. I believe such persons are enemies of Christ. Simple as that. If you're a pastor and you say, okay, we're not going to meet because the government says so. Do not meet, the government says so. I believe you're an enemy of Christ. That's just my take. Simple as that.
If I were going to do a protest or meet, what I would do is I would meet outside, even socially distant, like 2 meters or whatever it is for you.
Sure.
6 feet here. Even wear a mask, and just make them arrest you where it's like there's no possible way of like a super spreader event. You know what I mean? Like it's like we're outside. You're masking. You're doing all this just to show how ridiculous they are.
Yeah, that's right. Their laws are beyond rationality. They're about control.
Yeah, just to say it's about control, not about health. And to me, like I would say, as someone who having this transplant for about 4 years now, you do recognize, like, maybe it's not the best thing that back in my younger days when I didn't feel well and I probably had the flu or something and I just went to work and powered through. Like if people are sick, you stay home.
Yeah.
But otherwise you just, go live your life,
Yeah.
You protect the vulnerable and then you let everybody else carry on. You take vitamin D. Yeah,
that's right.
Exercise.
Yeah.
And do as much stuff outside as you can, and then just do more takeout or whatever.
Yeah.
But then it's not like saying like it's either we all have to be. We don't take any precautions whatsoever.
Yeah, that's just stupid straw man. It's a stupid dichotomy,
right?
Which has been forwarded.
Anyway, but so I guess I do have another question. Would be like, so how do you interact with? Okay, so you have even the Christians you have to convince. I assume the non-Christians who, if you did meet, would think you're like, we have to deal with that a little, or I guess we did a little bit more in the past, but not so much now when everything's open, but or things are way more open now in the United States. I think the United States government the governments in all levels realized if they did a second crackdown, not that it was ever as the first one was completely horrible, but if they did a major lockdown a second time, people would freak out and there would be riots everywhere. So even in liberal New Jersey, where I am, there, especially because the governor is up for re-election or something, they know that it would not go well, and they couldn't do a second one. I'm convinced of it. Well, we're essentially ungovernable.
Lucky.
Relative. I think it's a relative thing. Maybe it's because there's 300 million people. Our government's incompetent. There's more 100%. Elections. They really care about being in power and having power. So
yeah, that they do.
So how would, I guess, are there even online? I guess all the interactions have to be online. How do you even talk to? It's really killed in evangelism. Really, this.
Oh yeah. So how would I interact with people who are convinced of erroneous, like pro-government, pro-lockdown stuff?
Or that you want to kill grandma, even if you want to meet or something?
Or you're going to love your neighbor, that I don't love my neighbor and all that bullcrap.
The internet term, the Branch Covidians.
Yeah, I've seen that. I think was it you who mentioned that one? And I was like, oh my gosh,
I didn't come up with it. Well,
I think you mentioned it, and I found it. I'm like, oh my gosh, I'm taking that. But So there is how I would respond to people who are of these views. It definitely depends, and it's a cliche to say this, but it depends on the context. I personally am of the philosophy that, like, if you see people spreading openly supporting, like, especially on a Christian page, for example, openly supporting heretical nonsense and just straight up evil views, that it can actually be beneficial to go kind of hard on them, not to a level where you're just spurting out emotion, but where you're very direct, very blunt, and you expose them very thoroughly, even to a degree where in a normal conversation that would turn them off from whatever you say. Because with the online platform, it is not just you and them, it is hundreds, if not thousands of people who are on looking. And I can know for a fact, as someone who was once very impressionable not too long ago, just some years ago, how an online argument is going between someone of my view and someone of the opposite view, how that is going, how the person on my side is going, whether they're going well or not, does genuinely have an impact on your morale and on your beliefs. So even if they're going very hard out, for example, it will nonetheless make you look at yourself and think, oh gosh, am I thinking this right? So with online, I like to combat this stuff. It's mainly if the person's aggressive. If the person's not aggressive, I'll obviously be much more respectable, but I'll still be very blunt. But otherwise, I do that. I go hard, more or less, in order to demonstrate, in order to basically have an effect on people who are reading, for the most part. And that's basically the case with mainstream normal debates, where you're not there to convince your opponent, you're there to convince the audience. Now, when it comes to one-on-one conversations, and I would use the same intellectual tactics both online and in person-to-person conversations. The rhetorical tactics, worlds apart. One of them you go super hard out. The other one, be more gracious, be more considering, and try to walk them through things. Like, try to find areas. I don't like the cliche of, like, oh, find common ground and all that, but that's true. It can be helpful, but walk them through, when you're one-on-one, step by step, through the implications of their worldview. Because if there's one thing I've learned, especially through James White, everything comes down to worldview. So you've got to demonstrate the implications of their claims on the level of worldview. So, and just the basic logic or lack thereof of their claims. So, perfect example is the whole "love your neighbor" retort. When we hear someone say, "If you love your neighbor, get the vaccine," blah 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 blah. One thing you can do first on the worldview level, you can say, hang on, let's take a step back. What does it mean to love your neighbor? And you go through that biblically, what it means to love your neighbor and all that stuff. And generally speaking, you can say, don't do harm to them, but also show them the truth. That is a massive, massive aspect to love. Dare I say, the main aspect to love. Because sometimes in showing someone the truth, you're going to have to harm them on the emotional level, if only temporarily. So that's the critical part. Loving your neighbor also includes telling them the truth and informing them on the truth. So that would include, in this case, that would include matters like, for example, the state does not have any God-given right to enforce and measures on people who have committed no crime, to treat them like prisoners, and to regulate their medical lives. There is no power that God has given that to the government. That is not loving your neighbor. And that's where you flip the dialectic, you flip the script on them. It is not loving your neighbor to tell them that they must submit to the whims of whatever a government says, no matter their personal situation, and to harm your neighbor, and to harm your community, to harm your church by forcing them to be submitted to a godless, tyrannical state. That is not loving your neighbor. The other thing you can say, the other tactic rather, is just to simply expose them on a logical level. So if we were to put it in a logical sequence of the whole love your neighbor retort, it is Christians, premise one, Christians are to love their neighbor. Premise two, the vaccines work. No qualification, just the vaccines work. Conclusion, therefore, you must take the vaccine to love your neighbor. What the problem, where many of these so-called self-proclaimed Christians are just so arrogant is that they do not address the second premise at all. They think the second premise is such a given that the needles are just these miracle cures with no problems whatsoever, any issues of long-term effects of trials and all that. No, that doesn't matter. Daddy government, daddy authority, my cherry-picked experts who happen to be cherry-picked by the media further, they say it's okay, therefore you must submit. They don't even address that second question. And they assume, by saying love your neighbor, they assume that the people who have concerns about the needles are so thick and so ignorant as Christians that they don't even know the principle of love your neighbor. That's what they are assuming, whether they know it or not. And that's an arrogance you've got to expose on that specific issue, on the logical area. You got to say, we both agree you got to love your neighbor. But A, as I demonstrated, love your neighbor means more than what you're saying. And B, the very problem that someone might have is with the efficacy of the needle. Someone may have a genuine concern about that. So to say that they're not loving their neighbor and not address that, that is arrogance. That is insulting. That is sinful behavior you should repent of. So that's just one, and that's just one topic. I wasn't even meant to address that topic specifically, but
no, it comes up so much.
It does. Yeah, it does. That's just an example. I can say so much more, but that's just an example of how you respond. You expose people's errors on the logical area. So take their arguments and unpack it yourself on a logical area. Find all the premises and assumptions that they have in their claims that they're saying, these so-called Christians. Personally, I don't even bother myself with arguing with unbelievers because the premise is just so wildly different. Obviously, evangelism is another thing, but I'm not evangelizing, so I don't even bother arguing with unbelievers most of the time. With believers, on the other hand, unpack the logical assumptions and the premises behind their claims, and then walk through it, see where the problem is, and expose that to them. But then also expose the worldview problems. Like, so the assumptions that are based in worldview, expose those and point out the actual biblical thing, and then take control of the framing. That's how you do it. Framing is everything. Take control of the framing and flip it back on them.
You know, the other tact I think I would go to is that the Torah, if it can be summed up as love your neighbor and love God, and if that's how it can be summed up, then we should be able to see in the details of the Torah those principles, right?
Yeah, that's right. That's what we do. I've seen
so there,
quite a few
there
demonstrations of that.
There would have to be some sort of principle analogous to getting the vaccine. If in the Torah, in the actual Torah, what I generally see is, it's probably the adiaphora. It's like there's nothing, if it's against your own conscience, do it. Make the best medical decision you can for yourself. But I'm trying to think of there any law in the Torah. Now, obviously, if you know you're sick.
Yeah, that's right. And that is addressed in the Torah. Right. A direct case of sickness. When someone is directly found to have leprosy, then I believe it's the priest will come and basically fumigate the place or something like that.
Yeah.
And that's after a direct case.
Speaking of typology, since we have to tackle typology at some point, but I do think that's a typology of excommunication, where they examine the house sense. And then it's like, oh, they come back and then, it's still bad and destroy the house. Anyway, that's just me.
Yeah.
But but I was saying there's an actual process.
Yeah.
Where it's like, if I'm coughing and I have a persistent cough and I have other symptoms and I've lost the sense of smell or something.
Yeah, that's right.
And then I just go out and start talking to people or something. That is way different than someone who's just not doing
an asymptomatic carrier. It's fairly different to an asymptomatic carrier too, and that's something that's exploited a lot by these state shills, where they'll say, "Oh, you could." That's why we need these measures, because you could carry the virus and you don't know it. Well, for one, influenza, there is also asymptomatic cases of influenza, and even if it's not as much as the COOF, influenza still does in the United States kill at least tens of thousands of people a year.
If you want to wear a mask and have other precautions, that makes sense. But
go ahead, do that yourself.
To basically make everyone, if I'm not saying just go hog wild French kissing everybody and licking doorknobs everywhere you go, there's a prudential matter of
Yeah.
like, okay, we're gonna like, maybe we're gonna spread out in the church. We're not gonna all be up front or something like that. Like, let's use our seating, spread out in our church or something like that.
Right.
And I think that's fine. And hand sanitize, and how much flu could have been prevented if people just wiped
Oh, yeah.
disinfected doorknobs and surface
that's right.
areas and stuff like that.
That's something that the very shill lot do not consider, with the implications. To go back to worldview, the implications of their worldview applied consistently. So they'll say these means of gaslighting and guilting people who are otherwise innocent, saying you could carry the virus and you don't know, and then you could spread it to grandma and you can kill grandma and all that stuff. It's all based.
In other words,
on
it's called living.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly.
And I think
if I may finish this, because this is key.
Sorry.
It's all based on could. This could happen. This could happen. This could happen. And of course, and it's very commonly, this is a very common reply, but I'm yet to see any of these shills, even the smart ones, give anything close to a response that accounts for it, where you unknowingly take risks that could kill somebody every day. The most direct example, influenza. Does it kill as much as COVID? No. Statistically speaking, it is not as fat-tailed as COVID. No, it isn't.
I got a better example.
When they make these, but here's the thing: they're making a moral claim that is qualitative, not quantitative. They are not saying, when they say this, when they say love your neighbor and all that, it is based on the qualitative reality that you could spread a virus to an individual neighbor and it could kill them. And if they want to do that, which they do en masse, then they have to apply that consistently to influenza. You could spread influenza to grandma and you could kill grandma. So then I like to ask them directly. I've done this multiple times and I don't think I've ever gotten a reply to it, like in public forums. If you believe this consistently, why did you not mask up and lock down for influenza? If this is genuinely a rational position you've taken by actually thinking this, and you didn't just believe it because daddy government and daddy experts said so, then why did you not mask up and lock down for influenza, which still kills people, and you could kill someone right now or back in 2019 with influenza unknowingly? Why didn't you do that?
Well, as someone who is immune suppressed, I was well aware of what this, granted, back then it was like, why are they sending their kid in with the flu when they know he's sick? Okay.
Yeah.
Different case. But
yeah, absolutely.
I was well aware, like, we make trade-offs in society all the time.
Absolutely.
Where the example I always go to is, do you drive? To the Branch Davidians, do you drive?
Yeah.
Do you get in a couple ton car and go above 5 miles per hour? Do you?
Yeah, that's right.
We make trade-offs. Now, granted, that's the part of the trade-offs are like, we're not going to go 100 miles per hour.
Yeah. Okay.
We're going to have speed limits or something like that. But to think that like trade-offs are evil inherently is not how society has ever operated.
It's naive.
And people are saying, oh, well, you're just concerned about the economy or something like that. Well, yeah, because the economy.
I am. Yeah.
Well, you're a destitute people. You can only. I assume your government's just printing money out of thin air like ours.
More or less, as far as I'm aware, more or less.
I mean, how are they paying for all that welfare?
Already.
How do they?
Yeah.
How do you shut down all the businesses?
Yeah, that's right. That's right. Like almost every Western nation, we're in debt. So yeah.
Okay, no, but so the increase in spending has to come from fiat, like money out of thin air.
That's right. Yeah.
That's not going to have a negative consequence. Well, do you think who do you think has better health outcomes? Poor countries or rich countries? Do you not think they're linked? Do you say it's only about the economy? It's like the economy means people's lives, people's livelihoods. And do you really want to see societal unrest? I saw an amazing video that went over some stuff. I sent it to you over Signal and stuff to our group chat, where there's 80-year cycles with wars, and it
Right.
usually comes at the end of like a debt super cycle, is what they think.
Interesting.
And when economic growth stagnates, that's when societal conflict comes, and then you get war. And
Yeah.
so to just say it's and a lot of the economic growth over the last 200-300 years has been driven by science and technical advances. And if we got all the low hanging fruit and we don't have a like rapidly growing pie anymore, we're going to see a lot of war, and we're going to see a lot of friction within society. I hope we don't start looking like what I see in South Africa or something like that. Right
Yeah.
now.
Oh God no.
Where when there's growth, people don't feel like they have to take it from someone else.
Yeah.
So
Yeah, that's right.
so the people are just like, oh, you want to let people die because of the economy. It's like, well, that's what we do every year, every day.
Yeah. That's
We
what
do
you
let-
did before 2020.
We do
I
let
point to that
people
interlocutor. Yeah.
we do let people die because we do make trade-offs. Now there's a difference between saying we have a certain allowance for, we're gonna not drive 5 miles an hour because
Right.
and we know a certain amount of people are gonna die. That's not the same thing as actively running someone over in the road on purpose,
That's right.
or driving drunk or something like that.
That's right. I was going to mention the principle from the Torah itself, where there is no concept in the Torah of punishing people because they took a risk. So, for example, the whole thing with building codes, speed limits, and all that, on my personal like moral level, this may be a bit of a hot take, but like at least insofar as they're enforced by a state body, I'm against those. I'm all for people like communities and all that, establishing communities, companies, individuals, whoever, establishing building codes, establishing regulated means of like car movement within their community and all that stuff. I just like, and then, I don't know if you share this opinion, Jeff, but like, I just don't believe that's the state's role to punish people for merely taking something that can be considered. Because don't forget, to a large degree, this is mainly the case with traffic, less so the case with building codes, but especially the case with traffic. Road laws are necessarily, to a degree, arbitrary, because you could still kill someone going the speed limit and obeying every single road law. It just takes one person to be stupid. So point being, the Torah does not punish people. I cannot find any instance of the Torah punishing people for taking a risk or not taking a hypothetical precaution. Do you know any of those? Or
the only thing I can think of is if you don't build like a fence around the roof,
and if someone falls off.
Yeah, so you don't get
I was going to
punished.
mention exactly that.
It's only if you were like, so if you don't do that and someone falls off, you get punished.
Yeah.
But if you don't think of it as someone might have been someone associated with Apologia mentioned this or something, because it was in relation to theonomy or something. They were mentioning this.
I do believe I got that too. Yeah.
Where if your blinker is broken or whatever, that you just don't get pulled over, but and then you have an interaction with a cop or something. But if you do get pulled over for something significant, and then your blinker is busted or something, then maybe it gets tacked on or something. Like there's certain things like that where So going for the roof analogy in the Torah, what that shows us is that it would be like if I don't put a fence around my pool, I'm not going to get busted. I mean, more children die of drowning in pools than in gun deaths in America.
Yeah.
So it would be, I'm not going to get punished for not putting a fence around my pool. But if I don't put a fence around my pool and a kid drowns, then that would be the similar principle.
Yeah,
that's the only analogous thing.
Because the beauty, that's exactly what I was going to bring up. Exactly the example I was going to bring up. Because the beauty of the logic behind that that case law is that It accounts for the fact that we take risks every single day, and we have to be allowed to take risks. Because, like, for example, there may be an exceptional circumstance for why, for example, you don't have parapets around your roof, or why you don't have a fence around your pool, or why your blinker at one moment is broken. Maybe you're going to the mechanic right now, for example, and your blinker is broken. You're driving with your broken blinker. So not punishing someone for risk allows for someone to continue living their life, but with the conscious responsibility, knowing that they are carrying a certain risk, and that is something they choose to take. That is something absolutely necessary. Everyone has to make individual decisions on risk every single day. But if you do have a certain risk that you acknowledge you have, and something bad happens because of that conscious risk you took, then there can be punishment. And of course, there has to be a line as to what risks should be punished and what not, because
if
you take a risk every day.
Yeah. If your risk sorry, I was talking over you. If your risk is just like getting on the road, it's not like you're drunk or anything like that.
Yeah, that's
but
right.
if your risk is just you get on the road and someone else got on the road and there's an accident, you both assume that risk. To me, like,
and you can't be punished for getting on the road.
Right. What makes this analogous to the COOF, to me, would be we take the elderly, we take people like me, we take people with diabetes or whatever. You identify the high risk, you protect them, and then you let everybody else get on the road if they want.
Yeah.
Using this analogy. And if you don't want to get on the road and you want to stay in your basement, stay in your basement.
That's right. That is exactly what I've said to a bunch of these people who are absolute lockdown shills, where you actually have, in a non-lockdown world, you actually have the freedom. If you are so paranoid and baby, like, obviously you're an exception because you're vulnerable, right? But otherwise, if you're like
I take precautions, but I go out in the world.
Yeah, that's right, exactly. Yeah. But like, if you're like young, you're healthy, and thus you are incredibly astronomically unlikely to suffer from this virus, and yet you still have an irrational fear of being hospitalized or on the ventilator or dying, and you're so scared you don't want to do that. That's fine. You can make that choice to do that. You are a human. You are presumably an adult. You can make that choice to lock yourself up in your room, lock yourself up in your house, maybe get Uber Eats for every single meal, maybe get someone to do the groceries for you. You can do that. You have that freedom. Guess what? I likewise have the freedom to choose to take certain risks and go out and actually have a social life and meet up and assemble with the body of Christ. That is the ultimate irrationality, where these people who enforce these lockdowns, they borderline do not believe that individuals exist. They think humans are a blank template that are more or less exactly the same across all things, and that all societal contexts are the same. Thus, we just lock down everything. That's it. That's not how life works. And unfortunately, that attitude is more understandably like pervasive among like the city slickers, people who live such monotonous lives across standardized everything and all that. But otherwise, you actually have the freedom to do this stuff. You can make the personal risk. The great thing about not locking down like that is that it gives you responsibility for your life. You can choose to take risks as you always had before the inception of the COOF. But in a lockdown, I don't have the freedom to take risks. Freedoms which I otherwise always had, and you never complained about it until the government said, oh, COOF bad, therefore lockdown. The inconsistency is absolutely incredible. It is astronomical. And it shows that these people think that they have responsibility over the lives of people who live 1,000 miles away. Like, I could be arguing with someone in Australia who otherwise lives like on the opposite side of the continent, and yet they still think that they have any right to demand that 1,000 miles away in a totally different context, must be locked down for their fear. That's what it comes down to fundamentally.
I think I had this worked out in my head earlier than most because I was immune suppressed prior to 2020. So I knew when I went out, I took risks. And when I went to New York for work and I had to be on a bus with a bunch of people in flu season, I wore a surgical mask. And guess what?
There you go.
It was just me and the Asian ladies in the Port Authority wearing surgical masks. And then it was just like, and I didn't freak out about the mask because my doctors had told me in 2017 to, like, especially during flu season and, tight quarters and stuff, like, you might want to wear a mask. And I was like, okay. And so I take my precautions, and people who weren't wearing masks, I didn't think they had to wear a mask. I didn't never thought like, oh, I need to force everybody to do this for me. I just wore a mask and I looked weird, and now I don't look weird.
Yeah.
Does that make sense? Whereas, like,
that makes perfect sense. It exposes.
And when I went to church, I'll let you. I'm sorry. I'll just finish this and then let you talk.
No, go for it.
When I went to church during flu season and I was wearing a mask, I was the only one in my church wearing a mask, and I didn't think everybody in church was horrible for not wearing masks. Now, I do wish that, like, there were some people who were coming to church sick. I wish they didn't come to church sick. But I think post-pandemic, I don't think that'll happen much anymore. But even then, I understood that they just really wanted to come to church and they power through. And I probably did that like 50 times, like, before I had a transplant. I wasn't even cognizant of, like, oh, that 85-year-old who went to church, maybe I shouldn't come to church when I had a 90 some degree fever, 100-degree fever and a cough. That probably wasn't the most loving thing to do, but when people who die. So anyway, that's it. It's like, you cover all these things with love. You don't, like, you let people make their own decisions and live their lives, and you make precautions for yourself. That's right.
And that beautiful example of yours, it brings up, and what I mentioned, it ultimately brings up what is the core principle being warred over and being disputed by people that people don't acknowledge, but this is ultimately what it comes down to, and it comes to who is responsible for your body. Are you responsible for your body, or is the state responsible for your body? It's an either or. You can't have both. It's mutually exclusive. And if people fundamentally believe you are responsible for your body, then, okay, now you have just denied the legitimacy of everything from lockdown to otherwise. And of course, people will say bull crap like, oh, but it's not just about you and your health, but you could spread it to grandma. Okay, great. So apply that consistently to the influenza. Apply that consistently to everything.
Protect grandma.
Yeah, protect grandma. That's it. Protect grandma.
Wear masks around grandma. Social distance around grandma. Keep grandma locked up in a tower.
Exactly.
Or if you're working in an old folks home, like, maybe mandating a vaccine for those people makes sense, but I don't need to do it for society in general. Or if grandma is okay with, like, hey, grandma, we're not vaccinated, can we come over? And she's like, sure. Then that's a risk grandma assumes.
That's ultimately it. It's a two-way responsibility. I'm responsible for my own body, and the community's responsible for its own safety as well. But I'm responsible for my own body, but also I'm responsible for the protection of my community. That's the key thing there. I am responsible for what I do in my community, not the state. I am responsible for whether I go out in a 5-ton car, whether I go out and potentially, without my knowledge, have some kind of viral disease and go out into the public and go out to the pub with my mates. I am responsible for that, not the state. Myself and the people I interact with are the ones who are the responsible parties who have to make the decision, not the state. That is not the state's purview. The state's purview is when evil happens and it has to be rectified by court of law. That is the role of the state. God did not give it any role beyond that. It is that simple. I'm responsible for my body. My friends and my community are responsible for their bodies. The state is responsible for justice. It is not justice. It is not praising good and punishing evil to say that I cannot go out and hang with my friends who may be on the brink of suicide, and I can't do that because of the potential risk of a virus. Well, they say to me, I don't give a stuff about a potential virus, I'm about to kill myself and I need company, and they are okay with me coming over, that is between us. That is not between the state. That is an assumed fact all throughout scripture, that people are responsible for whatever pertains to that which happens between them. The state is responsible for what pertains to it. That is justice. And even then, people between themselves can sort out matters of justice before it even gets to the state. That should be a last resort. If anything, I could, if I, for example, came out and just like had a punch up with a guy, we could resort it between ourselves and never have to go to the state. But the state is there anyway in case it can't be resolved out, and they have to bring things under control. That is the state's purview. Disease, what I do with my body, me and my friends meeting up with each other and knowing certain risk is not the purview of the state. That's simple.
I think, I think that's well said. I think it makes, if you have symptoms, it makes sense.
That's a different ball game altogether.
Yeah.
And the state could potentially crack down on you because you have something that could harm others. Yeah. That's I could grant that. Yeah.
If you have symptoms, and I think that's where the Torah comes in with the leprosy, which you mentioned.
Yeah.
Right. It's not like if you're the Torah doesn't have anything for asymptomatic leprosy or something.
I don't think that even exists, but yeah. Yeah.
Well, because disease is just a function of living in a fallen world.
Yeah, that's right.
And you're not going to escape it. All right, I don't see. Let's give a minute, see if anybody has any questions. I see we've been hovering between like 3 and 6 people, which for this time at night is amazing. I guess a couple Australians and stuff like that.
Yeah, I did share it with my mates, so maybe they're taking a look. Hello, any of the boys?
Do you know Edward, or is that
no, I don't. It looks like he's an Aussie, but maybe he came from my page. I think he might have come to my page.
All right. Do you have any final things you wanted to mention? We went over a lot of stuff.
Well, just one very simple message, and I guess exhortation, both to Australians, but especially to non-Australians. Resist tyranny whenever you can. If it's prudential, because it's very biblical, especially there's certain passage in 1st or 2nd Peter, to suffer injustice for the sake of the gospel. So in my case, for example, I am willing to suffer various injustices of having to wear a mask or I won't vaccinate. That's a personal line I'm drawing. That's a personal matter between me and God. Not because I'm anti-vax, but just because of not having an informed conscience. I don't have informed consent. Either way, I will personally choose to endure certain injustices in order to get into what I believe God has called me for, and that is teaching, right? That is very biblical, and you should do that. But if you likewise believe it is an opportunity that God has put you into, and it is your calling to be active and very vocal, dare I say physical even, with your resistance, so like just choosing not to go along with what the tyrants do, not just for your own sake, because there is such a thing as self-sacrifice, but for the sake of others, the sake of those people who may not be able to defend themselves around you, whether they're in your family, your church, community, wherever. If that is your calling to actively resist the state in that respect, in its acts of evil, 100% do that. That may be what God wants you to do. Otherwise, just that, generally speaking, for everyone, pick your battle or pick your war first. Pick your how would I say it? Your theater of war. That's it.
The hill you're going to die on. Or?
Exactly. Pick the hill you're going to die on. So my theater of war is going to be teaching, right? And that's the hill I'm going to die on. And act accordingly. Don't unnecessarily compromise your mission, even if it's technically morally okay to do something. But otherwise, avoid doing those things, even if they're morally okay, but if they compromise your mission. But then once you are in your theater of war, let loose. Go all ham. Don't give no regard to what the tyrants want. Do what the Lord himself commands. That's it.
No, well said. Well said. Some of this, definitely pray for wisdom. I don't know, man. This is society's gone insane. It's like watching the Darkened Minds in real time is weird. So I don't see any questions, and I think we're out of stuff to talk about. So all right, thank you. We'll be praying for Australia.
Thank you.
And I hope this ends soon, but
yeah,
I don't know. I don't know if they're going to let it. So people like power.
Yeah, I think they know that they have to at some point. People are only going to tolerate it.
They can't break. Yeah.
Yeah.
All right.
Oh well.
God bless. I'll catch you on the flip side. All right.
Catch you all.
All right. Bye bye.